Night shrouds the valley in a silence, so complete it feels alive. It is not the silence of peace, it is the silence of waiting, the hush before something vast exhales. The air itself seems to tremble, as though the earth remembers what is about to unfold. A soft drizzle falls in threads so fine they seem woven from smoke, drifting through the mist like a veil drawn over a corpse. The valley sleeps, but uneasily. Beneath the weight of the clouds, time feels slow and heavy, as if the world itself hesitates to move forward. The moon hides behind a cloak of gray, its light too frail to pierce the storm-thick sky. What light remains bleeds through the fog in thin, silver veins, brushing faintly against the jagged bones of trees that stand like sentinels over the land. Their branches creak and shiver, whispering secrets to the wind, stories of those who came before, of fires once lit, of prayers once spoken and never answered. In that darkness, sound carries differently. Each drip of rain upon the leaves seems louder, every breath of the wind deliberate, as though the forest itself is listening. Beyond a ridge, the remnants of old banners sway where the dead were buried. Their cloth is stiff with age and blood, torn by wind and memory. The sigils they once bore, lions, crosses, suns, are now mere ghosts of color, devoured by mud and time. They flutter faintly in the drizzle, speaking of loyalties that no longer matter, kings who no longer rule, gods who no longer answer. Around their poles, the earth is soft, churned by the passage of boots and hooves, marked by the weight of those who never return home. Every gust of wind seems to stir the ghosts of those lost banners, whispering them awake. A horse shifts in the darkness, its breath clouding the air in a white plume. The sound is small, but it carries, rolling through the trees like the sigh of something ancient and tired. Its rider stands beside it, one hand resting on the animal's flank, feeling the quiet tremor of its muscles beneath the wet hide. The man's eyes glint faintly, not from light but from focus. He listens. He waits. Around him, others crouch in the shadows, their forms blurred by the mist, their movements deliberate and minimal. Every breath is measured, every glance purposeful. These are not knights in shining armor. They are mercenaries, the nameless, the unremembered, men bought and sold like iron, bound not by honor but by the promise of coin. Yet in the stillness of this night, they move with a grim unity that feels older than loyalty, heavier than fear. The drizzle beads along their cloaks, tracing the seams of fabric so drenched it glistens like oil. Beneath, their armor is darkened, dulled on purpose so that the moon, if it dared to return, would not betray them. Their faces are streaked with mud and ash, camouflage born of necessity, not ritual. In the dim light, their eyes flicker with the same quiet hunger for survival, for vengeance, for something that might never be named aloud. One kneels near the base of an ancient oak, the roots twisted and gnarled like the hands of an old god. He digs at the wet soil with his blade, tracing idle patterns in the mud, a circle, a line, a cross, symbols that once held meaning, now just nervous motion. The man beside him chews on a strip of leather, his jaw tense, his gaze distant. Another adjusts the strap of his cuirass, wincing as a cut on his shoulder opens again, leaking a thin line of blood that the rain quickly claims. None speak. They know the danger of words tonight. Even breath feels like betrayal. Farther back, the captain stands apart from them, motionless beneath a bent pine. His cloak, heavy and dark, clings to his shoulders like shadow made flesh. A thin scar runs from his temple down across his cheek, a pale river through a landscape of grime. He does not fidget. He does not move. His eyes are fixed on the valley below, where faint, scattered lights shimmer through the fog. Those lights mark the village, small hearths burning low against the damp, the fragile warmth of people unaware of what waits above them. From this distance, the glow looks peaceful, even holy. To him, it is only a target. He raises his hand, slowly, and every motion around him stills. The faint sound of rain on leaves becomes deafening in their shared stillness. In the absence of command, the men breathe as one. They know the rhythm. They've done this before, in other valleys, other nights, for other lords who have since fallen or been forgotten. The pattern repeats. The waiting, the descent, the fire. Each campaign is the same, yet somehow it feels different tonight. The silence feels heavier, like a warning. Even the forest seems to hold its breath. Down in the hollow, the faint toll of a bell drifts upward, a low, plaintive sound. The monks in the chapel are calling for prayer, unaware that heaven will not answer them tonight. The sound floats through the mist, trembling on the edge of the forest like a final plea. One of the younger mercenaries closes his eyes at the sound. Perhaps he remembers another bell from another village, another time, when he still had a name that meant something. But the moment passes. The bell fades into silence, and with it, whatever was left of his memory. The captain lowers his hand, not as a signal to attack, but as a gesture of restraint. One last pause. His gaze moves slowly across the faces before him. These are not brothers in arms. They are fragments of desperation bound together by necessity. He sees in them the spectrum of what war makes. The hardened, the haunted, the hollow. One man's lips move soundlessly. A prayer maybe, though to which God, none could say. Another stares blankly into the dark, eyes unfocused, lost somewhere far beyond this forest. They are waiting for his word, but he gives none. Not yet. The night stretches. The drizzle thickens. The valley holds its breath. The captain steps forward, boots sinking into the soft earth with a muted squelch. Beneath him, the ground is littered with fallen leaves, each slick with rain and decay. The smell of wet soil and dying foliage rises like incense. He can taste the metallic tang of his own breath, the faint oil from his armor, the ghost of smoke from distant fires long extinguished. Everything feels magnified. The pulse in his throat, the tremor of his fingertips, the slow, rhythmic drip of water from the brim of his hood. He kneels and touches the mud, rubbing it between his fingers. It feels cold alive. Once, long ago, he might have believed the earth could feel sorrow. But now he knows better. The earth feels nothing. It only remembers. Behind him, one of the men shifts, the faint creak of leather betraying his movement. The captain glances back. A nod passes between them. No words, no need. They all know what comes next. But even in that shared understanding, something unseen lingers in the air. A question without language, a hesitation without form. It hangs there, delicate as the mist itself. The wind stirs. Somewhere in the darkness, a lone raven caws, its cry slicing through the silence like a blade. The men freeze, every instinct alert. Then, slowly, they relax again. The raven is not an omen, or perhaps it is, but one they have long stopped fearing. Death follows them like a faithful hound. It does not need to announce itself. One of the older mercenaries, gray in beard, his armor dented from a dozen battles, glances toward the captain. His lips twitch upward, a grim half-smile. Always the waiting, his eyes seem to say. Always this breath before the plunge. The captain ignores the thought, but it echoes in him nonetheless. The waiting is worse than the killing. The waiting allows the mind to remember that those lights below belong to people. The butcher's wife, the boy who tends the mill, the priest who prays for rain and mercy in equal measure. The waiting is when conscience wakes, and that cannot be allowed. He draws a slow breath. The air tastes of rust and rain. Still, he hesitates. The sound of the bell fades completely now, swallowed by the forest. In its place comes the low murmur of wind moving through the valley, the the sound of breath across graves. It rustles through the branches and moves between the men like a hand upon their shoulders. Some mistake it for blessing, others for warning. From the far edge of the line, a man coughs once, muffled by his hand. Another shifts his weight, the chainmail whispering faintly. The forest responds with a ripple of sound, the faint creak of wet wood, the distant splash of water over stone. All of it seems amplified, as if the night itself is listening, waiting to see what they will do. In the village below, one last light flickers to life. A window opened, a candle set upon a table. A child, perhaps, restless in sleep. The captain's gaze fixes on it. The flame trembles, caught between life and wind, and for a fleeting moment, he wonders if that is what the soul looks like before it is extinguished. Small, fragile, unaware of how close the darkness stands. He closes his eyes. The rain thickens, running in cold rivers down his face. He feels it mingling with the ash that coats his skin, tracing through the dirt like veins of silver. The forest hums faintly, the sound of insects and leaves weaving into something like a low, living chant. Every sense sharpens. Every heartbeat counts down to the inevitable. When he opens his eyes again, the mist has grown thicker, rolling across the ground like slow fire. It gathers around the trees, swallowing their roots, softening the edges of the world until only outlines remain. Men turned into shadows, weapons into extensions of darkness. They could be ghosts already. He looks at them, his men, and sees the truth that binds them. They are not soldiers. They are not servants of kings or gods. They are instruments, tools in the machinery of war, given purpose only by destruction. Yet within their stillness, something almost sacred flickers. The silence they share is not absence, it is communion. In that hush they are one, and as the wind moves again, carrying with it the faint scent of smoke and rain, the captain finally lifts his hand. Slowly, deliberately, a signal. The world tightens, as if drawing its final breath. Below, the village still sleeps, unaware, unguarded, illuminated by the faint glow of hearths and dreams. Above, in the dripping dark, a dozen hearts beat in unison, their rhythm steady, fatal, ancient. The captain's fingers curl, and in that single motion, the silence of the valley deepens, pregnant, trembling, divine. For a heartbeat, even the rain forgets to fall. And then, the earth prepares to gasp. The abbey stands hollow, its walls breathing the long sigh of centuries. Stones once white as prayer now lie fractured and blackened by smoke. Moss creeps along the edges of broken saints. Their faces have been eroded into blank sorrow. The air itself carries a strange perfume, iron and incense, the mingling of blood and devotion, of war and worship, fused into one lingering ghost. Outside, the wind howls across the desolate fields of Burgundy, winding through the naked branches, threading through the empty bell tower where no bell has rung in years. Inside, silence reigns, not the silence of peace, but the heavy kind that presses against the ears like guilt. Through a hole in the shattered roof, a single beam of light spills down, cutting through the haze. It falls upon the center of the abbey's nave, where a sigil is carved deep into the flagstone, a black wolf devouring a star. The mark gleams faintly under the dust, as if the stone itself remembers the hands that etched it there. Is their mark the company of the Black Wolf, men who pledge themselves to no king, no cause, no god, only to the coin and to the code etched upon their blades. Strike first. Leave no warning. Around the dying fire in the center of the hall, figures move in silence. The flames cast shadows that dance like restless spirits along the broken walls. Armor glints in the dim light, not polished but worn to a dull sheen, the metal pitted and scarred. Each piece bears the story of another battle, another betrayal. The men are ghosts of 100 forgotten wars, sons of famine, bastards of lords, exiles and deserters who have seen both heaven and hell and found no difference between them. They sit with their backs against the stone, sharpening blades dulled by years of killing, faces half hidden beneath their hoods. The sound of whetstone against steel rises and falls, steady as breath. No one speaks. Words are too fragile a thing in such company. Only the fire crackles, and the wind murmurs through the open arches like a choir of lost monks. At the far end of the nave, where the altar once stood, a man sits alone. His cloak is heavy with frost. His left eye burns like an ember. The right is gone, sealed beneath a scar that splits his face from brow to cheek. His beard is coarse and streaked with ash. In the faint light, he seems carved from the same stone as the abbey itself. He is called Varen, though among those who fear him, he is known as the Unseeing. He sits with one hand resting on the hilt of his sword, the other holding a small piece of parchment sealed with red wax. The seal bears no crest, only a smear of color, a command with no name attached. For a long while he does not open it. He only stares at the fire, as though waiting for it to speak. The flame wavers. Shadows tremble across the stone walls, rising and falling like breath. Outside, a raven croaks, and its echo drifts through the broken arches. One of the men, broad-shouldered, his armor patched with strips of boiled leather, steps closer. His name is Garrett, and though his beard is silver, his eyes still gleam with the edge of youth that war never managed to take. "Another summons?" he asks quietly. Vera does not look at him. "A command." "From who?" "The kind that doesn't sign their name." Garrett nods. "That is answer enough." "Will we ride?" he asks, when the frost softens. Varen's voice is like gravel dragged across iron. "Before the thaw," they said. "Always before the thaw." He finally breaks the seal. The parchment unfolds with a soft crackle, dry as bone. To the company of the wolf, a rebellion stirs in the northern hills. Extinguish it before the spring thaw. Payment upon proof. No title, no crest, just those words, written in ink that seems to bleed. The candle beside him gutters. The flame bends as though in fear, casting his shadow across the ruined wall. Tall, misshapen, almost monstrous. Varen lowers the letter and closes his eye. Behind his lids, the world flickers to another time. He hears laughter, light, gentle, human, a sound so far from the present it almost hurts to remember. A woman stands before him in memory. Her hair the color of wheat, her smile small and unguarded. Her hands brush against his as she ties a strip of cloth around his wrist, a token, a promise. She tells him come back alive, and he had sworn he would. But loyalty had demanded otherwise. He had been ordered to strike at dawn, and she was among those he struck down. They called her a traitor, a spy, a danger to the code. He had done it himself, blade trembling, heart numb, and when it was done, something inside him had gone silent forever. He opens his eye again. The fire is lower now, a pool of dying orange. The letter trembles in his hand. He looks toward the sigil carved into the floor, the wolf devouring the star. Once it had meant power. Now it feels like a curse carved into the earth itself. The abbey creaks in the wind. Snow drifts through the broken roof and settles on the stone floor, melting into small, perfect circles of water. A voice breaks the silence. "Will it be blood again, Captain?" Varen turns slightly. It's Raoul, the youngest of them, his face still unweathered, his eyes too alive. He wears armor too large for him, the plates rattling softly when he moves. His voice carries the hesitance of someone who still believes in right and wrong. "It's always blood," Varen says. Raoul hesitates. "And after that?" Varen looks at him for a long time, then answers, "After that, there's always more." The boy nods, pretending to understand. He goes back to the fire, his shoulders hunched against the cold. Garrett leans against a column, his voice low. He'll learn. They all do. Varen folds the letter carefully and tucks it into his cloak. The wax crumbles, red dust on his fingers. Outside, the wind picks up, carrying with it a faint echo of chanting from some distant valley. The abbey stones seem to shudder at the sound. He stands. His movement draws every gaze in the room. Men straighten. Swords stop sharpening. The rhythm of breath changes. Varen's voice carries through the ruined hall, steady and low. We ride at dawn. A murmur ripples through them, not of excitement, not of fear, but of inevitability. They've lived too long in the service of commands to question one now. One by one, they begin their preparations. Armor is strapped tighter. Horses are saddled beyond the gates. The clink of metal echoes off the stones. Somewhere, a torch flares to life, its smoke curling upward like a dark prayer. Varen lingers by the altar. Once monks had sung here soft, pure hymns to the Virgin. Now, the air tastes of soot and ash. He reaches out and touches the stone surface, tracing the cracks with his gloved fingers. Underneath, he can still feel the faint carving of Old Latin in Noct Lux Mea. In the night, my light. He almost laughs. The words feel like a cruel joke. As he turns away, a piece of stained glass crunches beneath his boot. The shard catches the firelight and, for a moment, glows red, like a drop of frozen blood. Garrett approaches, holding out Varen's helm. The men wait. Varen takes it, running his thumb over the dent above the brow. A scar upon a scar. He does not put it on. Instead, he looks up through the broken ceiling. Clouds churn in slow agony above. Between them, the faintest trace of moonlight breaks through. He murmurs, barely audible, no kings, no gods, only the code. The words fall heavy in the cold air, half prayer, half curse. He steps into the night. The air outside bites deep. The frost glitters along the edges of the grass, and the horses stamp and snort in the fog. The men mount in silence, their movements practiced, mechanical. Varen swings into the saddle. The leather groans beneath his weight. For a moment, he looks back toward the abbey, its broken arches standing like the ribs of a fallen beast. The single beam of light that had touched the sigil now fades, swallowed by the night. He closes his eye and exhales. The breath hangs before him, white and ghost-like. The boy Raoul watches him from across the courtyard, waiting for a signal. Varen lifts a gloved hand. Ride. Hooves strike the frozen ground. First a few, then dozens. The sound grows, echoing through the valley like distant thunder. As they vanish into the fog, the abbey settles again into silence. The fire inside burns itself down to embers. The sigil on the floor gleams one last time before darkness swallows it whole. Above, the wind changes. Snow begins to fall, soft, endless, indifferent. And through it all, the scent remains, iron and incense. The perfume of war and faith, clinging to stone, to steel, to memory. Varen does not look back, but the abbey remains within him, its hollow echo, its silence. The ruins are not just behind him now. They are part of his marrow, carved deep as the sigil on the stone. The company rides into the fog like specters bound by a single command, a single truth carved upon their blades. Strike first, leave no warning. And so they vanish, the wolves in the mist, leaving behind only the whisper of hooves and the slow, dying breath of an abbey that once belonged to God. The first sound was not the clash of steel, but the slow, deliberate creak of leather straps tightening in the dark. It was the sound of men adjusting armor that had long since lost its shine, of reins pulled by hands that had forgotten gentleness, of breath held in the moment before the world breaks. Before the dawn could lift her veil, the 30 riders waited, motionless, statues carved from cold and shadow. Their silhouettes loomed at the edge of a sleeping town, their outlines blurred by fog that clung low to the earth. The air smelled of wet soil and horse sweat, of iron and distant rain. A faint wind stirred the banners tied to their lances, not the proud silk of kingdoms, but scraps of torn cloth, mismatched and forgotten, each bearing the remnants of wars that no longer had names. No one spoke. The silence among them was not born of discipline, but of exhaustion, the kind that seeps in a bone and replaces belief. They were mercenaries now, though once they had been soldiers of crowns and creeds. Once they had knelt before altars, sworn oaths before God and man alike. But the wars that had made them had also unmade them, leaving only the shell of what loyalty once meant. A horse stamped and snorted, its breath clouding in the cold. The captain turned his head slightly, and even that small motion was enough to ripple through the ranks like a silent command. He wore no crest, no sigil, no sign of noble birth. Only a dark surcoat stiff with old blood and the dull gleam of battered steel. His name had been known once, perhaps sung by his men or whispered by lovers in softer days, but now it lived only in rumor. To most, he was simply the captain, a man who never smiled, who spoke little, and whose eyes carried the color of extinguished fire. Somewhere beyond the mist, a church bell stirred. The sound was faint, uncertain, as though the wind itself were reluctant to carry it. Its tone was hollow, not a call to prayer, but a knell, a warning, a memory of sanctity echoing through the ruins of faith. The riders listened, their faces unreadable. They had heard bells before, in villages that begged for mercy, in cities that burned, in fields where priests prayed louder than the dying. To them, the bell was not divine. It was an omen. It was the sound of something ending. The captain's gaze fixed on the sleeping town below. A cluster of roofs, huddled together against the cold, smoke still rising from the chimneys of those who believed they would wake to another ordinary morning. Lanterns glowed faintly behind shutters, their light trembling like fragile souls unaware that dawn would never reach them. When the signal came, a brief flare of torchlight swallowed by mist, it was almost beautiful in its brevity. A spark against the fog, a single heartbeat of fire, and then darkness again. The riders moved. The sound of hooves breaking the earth began as a murmur, then grew into a low thunder that rolled through the valley. Leather groaned, blades whispered from scabbards, and the fog began to twist and scatter as if recoiling from their passage. No cries, no chants, no music of glory, only the relentless rhythm of movement, a quiet, murderous tide. Down the slope they came, and the first thing the town of Sancta Lucia felt was the tremor of the ground beneath its cobblestones. A dog barked once, uncertainly, and was silenced by the sudden crack of a crossbow string. A watchman on the tower leaned forward, peering into the white haze, trying to make sense of shapes that did not belong to morning. He reached for the rope beside him, fingers trembling as they found the cold, rough hemp. He drew in a breath, one that could have awakened the town, that could have given warning, that could have changed the night's story, but the arrow found him before the air could leave his chest. The sound he made was small, human, a sigh swallowed by the fog. His body sagged against the bell rope, and for a fleeting instant, the bell gave one low, accidental toll, a single note that rang through the streets like the final heartbeat of a prayer. Below, the first door broke. The wood splintered with a muffled cry, and the riders flowed inward, not as men, but as a storm without mercy. The blacksmith rose from his bed, still half in dreams, his calloused hands reaching for the hammer by instinct, but steel met flesh before memory could. The baker's wife stumbled toward the window, thinking it was thunder, and found the glass shattering inward. Her candle fell, its flame devoured by the rush of air. A child's toy, a small wooden horse, rolled across the floor, tapping gently against the wall. The town did not wake. It was simply extinguished. Street by street, light by light. The rain began to fall, thin at first, then steady, washing blood into the gutters. The sound of it, the hiss of rain on steel, became the only music in that darkened hour. No screams lasted long enough to echo. Only the rhythm of the storm and the quiet efficiency of men who had long since forgotten how to tremble. By the time the sun reached the horizon, there was no sun to see. The smoke had thickened into a ceiling of gray. Ash drifted in slow spirals, settling on the armor of the riders like pale snow. The scent of iron and soot hung heavy, thick enough to taste. One by one, the riders dismounted. They did not speak to one another. Their silence was ritual. It was not remorse. They had learned to live without that luxury, but rather the weary acceptance that killing had become the only language the world still understood. The captain walked through what remained of the market square. His boots left prints in the blackened mud, filling with water as the rain deepened. He moved without direction, as though some unseen compass guided him through the ruin. Around him, doors hung open, each revealing small, ordinary lives cut short mid-gesture. A loaf still warm on a hearth. A spindle half-wound with thread. A prayer book open to the Psalms of Mercy. He paused at each for a heartbeat, not out of pity, but recognition. He had been these people once, or near enough to remember what it felt like to deserve peace. Near the chapel, a wooden sign lay half-buried in ash. He bent down, brushing the soot away with his gauntlet. The letters, carved by some long-dead craftsman, read Sancta Lucia. The name lingered on his tongue when he spoke it aloud, soft, almost reverent. Sancta Lucia. It meant light, he remembered. The saint of sight, of clarity, of the small flame that endures the dark. He wondered if she had watched this night, and if her eyes had closed. He stayed there for a long moment, his gloved fingers tracing the carved edges of the letters until they blurred with rain. Then, slowly he rose. Behind him, the town was silent. No cries, no movement, only the whisper of water flowing through the gutters, carrying ash, blood, and the fragments of prayers toward the river that would forget them. His men were waiting near the edge of the square, their faces hidden beneath wet hoods, their armor streaked with mud and smoke. They did not meet his gaze. They did not need to. He was their gravity, the center that held their broken orbit together. He looked at them, counting without counting. 30 shadows, 30 ghosts, each carrying a fragment of a life that no longer fit. He knew the stories of their tokens. The rosary one man kept though he no longer prayed, the lock of hair another tied to his hilt, the small wooden toy that swayed from a saddle strap. He knew them because he had once carried his own relic, a ring, long lost, cast into a river after a siege he wished to forget. He felt the weight of their silence pressing against him. It was heavier than armor. For a moment, he wanted to speak, to tell them something that would make sense of the ruin, something that might turn this march through darkness into a purpose again. But words had become a currency too fragile to spend. Instead, he simply nodded, and like a flock of black birds startled into flight, the riders turned their mounts and began to move. The sound of hooves against the wet earth was muffled by rain, yet it filled the empty streets like a dirge. Their shapes faded into the mist one by one, until the last flicker of movement vanished beyond the northern road. Behind them, the ruins of Sancta Lucia smoked quietly. A faint glow lingered where the chapel had stood, its crucifix charred, its candles melted into puddles of wax. A single window remained intact, stained glass depicting the saint herself, a figure holding a lamp, her eyes serene. The firelight behind her made it seem as though she still watched them leave. The captain glanced back once, not long enough to be called hesitation, just long enough to see that faint shimmer of color through the rain. For an instant, he felt something shift, a memory, or maybe just the ghost of one, of what it had meant to believe that light could outlast night. But the moment passed, swallowed by the rhythm of the march, by the endless repetition of duty without meaning. The road stretched ahead, glistening like a blade. Each step carried them further from the ruin, yet the sound of the bell, that accidental toll, seemed to follow, faint and persistent, as though the town refused to let them go. They rode until the outlines of Sancta Lucia disappeared behind the hills. The rain thickened, turning the horizon into a smudge of gray where sky and earth became the same. No one looked back again. Only the captain, in some private corner of his mind, carried the memory of that small, carved name, and the way the word Lucia had felt like light trying to survive inside his throat. Behind them, the world smoldered. Ahead, there was only more coin, more death, and more silence. And between those two infinities, the 30 riders disappeared into the fog, as if they had never been, as if the night itself had swallowed its own sin. A gray rain fell upon the marshlands of Flanders, thick with the scent of peat and decay. It clung to the air like mourning cloth, turning every breath into a memory of something long lost. Through this sodden haze rode the company known only as the Black Suns. No heralds announced their coming. No prayers marked their passing. Only the sound of hooves, slow, heavy, deliberate, pressing into the drowned earth as if even the soil itself wished to swallow them whole. Their banner bore no crest, no color, no hope, just a torn strip of cloth, dark as sin, soaked eternally in mud. To those who glimpsed them from afar, they were less men than shadows, flickering shapes that haunted the horizon and dissolved when the fog grew thick. They had once been soldiers of God, crusaders, men anointed by fire and blessed by the promise of paradise. But faith, like flesh, does not keep long on the road. It spoils. It festers. And so they rode now not for heaven, but for coin, silver enough to dull the ache of the soul and feed the empty silence that followed them from battle to battle. At night, when the rain whispered against their tents, they drank in near silence. The fire was small, its light trembling like a dying star. None spoke of the faces that visited them in dreams, faces veiled in smoke, in flame, in the soft wailing of memory. They had forgotten the prayers they once knew, and even the priests among them had long stopped pretending to remember the words. Among them rode Sir Aldrich of Rouen, once a knight, now something hollow that wore the shape of one. Around his neck hung a small iron key, blackened, plain, and always cold against his skin. No man dared ask what it opened. Some whispered it belonged to a cathedral door he had burned. Others believed it unlocked a grave. But Aldrich never spoke of it. He would touch it sometimes, when the night was at its stillest, as if to remind himself that something yet remained locked away, something best left so. The march brought them to the river fortress at Ghent, a garrison manned by weary soldiers and guarded more by the illusion of peace than by walls. Dawn had barely broken when the first of Aldrich's scouts returned, their armor slick with rain. The river had risen high, swelling against its banks, its waters carrying the color of slate and sky. When they struck, they did so with the quiet efficiency of men long practiced in cruelty. Arrows cut through the fog like whispered accusations. The first scream came from the battlements, quickly swallowed by thunder. Then chaos, the clash of iron, the bark of orders, the choking wet sound of steel meeting flesh. The Black Suns moved as one, disciplined, deliberate, merciless. It was not the fury of battle that guided them now, but ritual. Killing was no longer an act of passion, but of purpose. Every thrust of a sword was a remembrance. Every fall of an enemy, a confession made in steel. By the time the storm broke, the river had turned the color of wine. Bodies drifted in the current, spinning lazily like offerings to a god no one prayed to anymore. Aldrich stood upon the bank, his gauntlets black with blood and rain. He knelt, unbuckled the steel, and let the cold water bite into his hands. The reflection that stared back at him was both his and not his, the eyes hollow, the mouth uncertain, as though the river itself were trying to remember who he had been. The current carried it away. Only ripples remained. Only silence. Behind him, one of his men approached. A boy, hardly more than 17. His face was pale beneath the rain. "Sire," he stammered, "the commander's tent. It's burning." Aldrich did not turn. "Let it burn," he said quietly. The boy hesitated, watching the fire consume the remains of the camp, then spoke again, voice trembling. "Was it true, sire? What they said, that we once fought for the cross?" Aldrich's eyes drifted toward the black horizon. The rain had softened now, falling in thin, weary threads. "We fought for light," he said, "and in finding it, we burned our sight away." The boy said nothing more. He bowed his head, and the sound of his steps faded into the hiss of the dying storm. When the last ember of the fortress dimmed, Aldrich withdrew the iron key from his neck. For a long time, he turned it in his fingers, feeling its edges, its weight, its chill. There were moments when he imagined it opening not a door, but time itself, unlocking the years before the blood, before the ash, before the rain that never seemed to end. He closed his fist around it. The world was too wet for fire, but still it burned in his palm. As the company moved onward, the marshlands gave way to the dim plains beyond Bruges, a country of graves and wind. The clouds hung low, dragging shadows across the land like a funeral shroud. Villagers hid when they passed, whispering their name as though it were a curse, the Black Suns. At times, the fog would part and reveal distant church towers, pale spires reaching toward a sky that no longer answered. Bells would toll faintly, though no hand pulled their ropes. Some said the wind itself carried the memory of worship, others that the earth still prayed for the dead. And always in the quiet that followed, Aldrich could hear it, faintly, beneath the wind, a sound like breathing, like voices murmuring from beneath the soil. They had been men of faith once. That was their greatest wound. For what is a knight without his cause, a priest without his God, a soldier without his truth? The world had taken these from them, piece by piece, until all that remained were ghosts bound by hunger and habit. The nights grew longer, the rain colder, and as the company rode north toward the sea, Aldrich began to feel that they were being led rather than leading, as if the land itself had claimed them, drawing them towards something vast and unseen. One evening, as dusk bled across the horizon, Aldrich halted his horse. The others slowed behind him, confused. Before them lay a field, empty, endless, silent. In the distance stood a single tree, bare and black against the twilight. He felt it then, the faint pull, the whisper of memory, the ache of a forgotten vow. The key at his neck grew heavy. "Camp here," he said. His voice was low, almost reverent. "Tomorrow, we ride for the coast." The men obeyed. Fires were lit, small and shivering in the damp. And as the night deepened, Aldrich stood alone beneath the tree, staring into the dark. He did not pray. He no longer knew how, but somewhere within him, something stirred, faint as the flutter of wings beneath the ribs. Perhaps guilt, perhaps the memory of grace, or perhaps the first shadow of what awaited them beyond the marsh, beyond the rain. The wind rose then, carrying with it the scent of salt and storm, the sea calling. He closed his eyes, and in the darkness he saw her again. A woman's face, pale as moonlight, framed by the smoke of a burning chapel. Her lips moved, but no sound came. Her eyes, wide and filled with both love and accusation, held him until the vision faded. He opened his hand. The iron key was warm now, pulsing faintly, as if it too remembered her. Once, long ago, he had made a promise at her grave. A promise never kept. The rain had taken her name, but not the weight of her silence. It followed him like a second shadow. That night, he dreamed of the Holy Land, of burning sands and crimson banners, of priests crying into the wind as towers fell. He dreamed of the smell of myrrh and blood, of the cries of dying men echoing against stone. And he dreamed of the voice that had called him then, "Aldrich, hold the gate." He had obeyed, not for glory, but because faith had demanded it. Now, he wondered if that voice had ever been divine, or simply another man lost in the same madness. He woke before dawn, his armor damp, his hand clutching the key as if it were his only anchor in a world slowly drowning. When morning came, the fog had thinned, revealing the faint shimmer of the sea in the distance. The men stirred, weary and hollow-eyed. Some whispered of omens, of ravens perched along the path, of strange lights flickering in the marsh. Aldrich said nothing. He mounted his horse and led them toward the coast. The road wound between ruined chapels and overgrown graves. Once they passed a stone cross half buried in the earth, its surface carved with names no one could read. Aldrich paused there. The wind hummed through the cracks like a faint hymn. He reached out and touched the stone. It was cold, but beneath the moss, he could feel the faint trace of a carved word, Pax. Peace, a promise never fulfilled. By noon, they reached the cliffs overlooking the sea. Below them, waves crashed against jagged rocks, throwing up plumes of salt and foam. The horizon was a pale bruise of light and mist. The men dismounted, gazing at the endless expanse. "What now, sire?" one of them asked. Aldrich did not answer at once. He walked to the edge, the wind tearing at his cloak. For a moment, he felt the weight of every life he had taken, every prayer left unsaid, every road that had led him here. Then he drew the key from his neck and held it toward the sea. He thought of the cathedral he had burned, the one where she had sung. He remembered the flames licking the stained glass, the crucifix shattering as the roof caved in. He had kept the key as penance, as memory, as proof that he had once believed. And now, with the salt wind stinging his face, he opened his hand and let the key fall. It turned once in the air, caught the faint glint of light, and vanished into the waves below. The sea swallowed it without sound. Behind him, the black suns watched in silence. They did not ask why. They did not need to. They knew that something had ended. Perhaps a curse, perhaps a vow, perhaps the last illusion of redemption. The rain began again, light as breath. Aldrich turned away from the sea. "We ride east," he said. His voice carried no command, only weariness. The men followed, vanishing once more into the mist, their silhouettes dissolving into the gray horizon. As they disappeared into the fog, the sea roared below, endless and indifferent. And far off beyond the clouds, a single shaft of light broke through, weak, trembling, and fleeting. But for an instant, it caught the waves, turning them silver, as if something holy had stirred once more in the heart of the broken world. The tavern doors swung open with the wind, scattering smoke and sawdust across the floor like ghosts fleeing the light. A single candle guttered, and for a heartbeat, all sound died. Tankards paused midair. Dice froze in a gambler's hand. Even the hearth fire seemed to draw in its breath. At the threshold stood 5 men, their faces half in shadow, cloaks dripping with the relentless rain. The storm clung to them like memory, old, bitter, and cold. Their boots carried the weight of long miles and heavier sins. These were not men who sought warmth or rest. They were messengers of something darker. The feared mercenaries had come. Their presence pressed against the walls like a rising tide. One laid a tarnished coin on the counter, a payment, or perhaps a warning. Another placed the jagged remnant of a sword upon the wood, its edge still stained from a past no one wished to recall. The innkeeper's hands trembled as he poured their ale, the liquid quivering as it filled the cup. No one dared to ask their names. Names gave shape to men, and these shapes were better left unspoken. In every kingdom, they were called something different: the Pale Riders, the Nameless, the Hand of God's Anger. But such titles only scraped the surface of what they were. They were hunger itself, wrapped in flesh and iron. Hunger for coin, for blood, for absolution that would never come. A gust rattled the shutters. The fire hissed. A child stirred in the loft above, whimpering in his sleep. The leader, a man with eyes the color of winter stone, lifted his gaze to the sound, then looked away. Even the innocent were burdens in his silence. No one spoke again until the wind did. The night deepened. Rain whispered against the thatch roof like a secret being told again and again, until even the drunkards had fallen into uneasy dreams. But the mercenaries did not sleep. Their faces, hollow and unlit by the hearth, were turned toward some thought only they could see. Each man carried the stillness of his own ghosts, the ones that walked beside him, unseen yet always felt. One of them, the youngest, reached toward the flame with a gloved hand, tracing its edge as though testing its warmth. "Do you ever wonder," he murmured, "if the souls remember who took them?" No one answered. The leader's eyes shifted, and the question fell dead between them. In their world, wondering was dangerous. To feel was to break. When the last ember dimmed, they rose without a word. Cloaks gathered, buckles tightened, blades sheathed. The tavern door opened once more, and the wind, as if waiting, rushed in to claim the silence they left behind. Outside, the night was endless. Their horses waited, steam rising from their nostrils, eyes gleaming in the dark like old coins. They mounted and rode into the storm, the rhythm of hooves swallowed by rain. No torches, no banners, no sound save the whisper of mud beneath iron. Their destination was a manor beyond the valley, where rumor had wrapped itself around the walls like ivy, rumors of treachery, of letters sent to the wrong hands, of oaths broken in secret. The order was clear: erase it. No trace, no survivors. The kind of command that required no question, only obedience. The moon hung low, a silver eye behind torn clouds. It watched them for a time, then slipped away, unwilling to bear witness. When they reached the manor gates, they dismounted as one. The iron was slick beneath their gloves. The youngest among them hesitated, staring at the crest carved above the archway, a pair of swans, wings entwined. There was something human in that hesitation, something almost fragile. But the leader's voice broke it like glass. "Move." They crossed the courtyard. The rain softened their footsteps. A dog barked once from somewhere within, a lonely sound that ended too quickly. Then the door was kicked open, and the world split in two, before and after. Inside, the warmth of firelight painted the walls gold. It was a home of laughter once. The echoes of it still clung to the corners. A servant turned, eyes wide, mouth open to scream, but the blade silenced him before breath could. The others followed. Rooms filled with shouts, the clash of steel against wood, the weeping of those who understood too late. The lord of the manor came down the stairs in his nightrobe, sword trembling in his hand. He was not a soldier, just a man trying to defend what he loved. The leader met him halfway. Their blades struck once, twice, and then the lord fell, his blood pooling against the woven rugs. His wife's cry rose behind him, breaking the night open. Somewhere, a girl's prayer whispered from beneath a table. "Please," she said, "please let morning come." But morning was far away. The leader paused in the hall, breathing the heavy air of smoke and oil. His sword hung at his side, dripping. For a moment, his reflection in the shattered mirror across the room seemed like another man entirely, one who might have once believed in redemption. But belief was a luxury that had long since burned away. He turned to his men. "Finish it." The words were simple, but they cut deeper than any blade. By the time the first rooster crowed miles away, the manor was gone. Fire consumed it, devouring memories faster than time ever could. The walls groaned, the roof collapsed, and with it fell the weight of generations. The mercenaries watched in silence as the flames ate the sky. None spoke, none prayed. When the last beam crumbled, they mounted again. The leader glanced back once, just once, and saw through the smoke a figure standing in the ruin. Perhaps a trick of the light. Perhaps not. They rode into the mist, and the world behind them turned to ash. The dawn came slow and colorless. The air smelled of rain and burnt wood. Fields rolled past, heavy with fog, as though the earth itself sought to hide its sorrow. The mercenaries rode in single file, the clink of armor a heartbeat in the silence. After a while, the youngest spoke again, voice low and frayed. "Do you think they were guilty?" The leader did not answer. His eyes remained on the horizon, where the light broke faintly through the clouds. "Does it matter?" Another man muttered. "It should," the young one said. A long pause followed, filled only by the rain tapping against their helms. Finally, the leader said, "Once you begin asking, you've already lost." No one spoke after that. The road stretched before them, winding between dead trees and forgotten milestones. Ravens watched from branches, black eyes glinting. The wind carried the scent of smoke still, as though the world refused to let them forget. At midday, they reached a stream. The leader dismounted, kneeling beside the water. His reflection trembled in the current, blurred, uncertain. He dipped his hand, letting the cold bite his skin. A single coin fell from his glove into the water, spinning before vanishing beneath the ripples. "For the dead," he whispered. The young mercenary heard and frowned. "You think they'll forgive us?" "No," the leader said, "but perhaps they'll remember us kindly." The words drifted away, carried by the wind toward the fields where no one would hear. They rode again. Villages passed like ghosts. Windows shuttered, smoke rising thin and gray. Once they passed a church, its bell tolling in the distance. Each strike seemed to follow them, counting not hours but souls. By nightfall, the rain had stopped. The sky cleared, revealing stars sharp as knives. They made camp in the ruins of an old chapel, the walls half-eaten by ivy. Inside, a stone angel watched over them, wings broken, face eroded by time. The youngest sat before the fire, staring at the flicker. "Do you ever think," he said softly, "that maybe God stopped watching long ago?" The leader glanced at him, eyes unreadable. "No," he said, "he's still watching." He just turned his face away. Silence settled, heavy and familiar. The fire burned low, casting their shadows against the crumbling altar. One by one, the mercenaries lay down to rest. But sleep came only to some. For the leader, there was only the endless whisper of the wind through the broken glass, the sound like distant voices calling his name. In dreams, he saw the manor again, the flames, the faces, the raven perched upon the gatepost. It called once, and the sound was like memory trying to stay alive. When morning came, he rose before the others. The world was still, washed clean by the night's rain. Mist coiled along the earth like breath. He stood for a long time, watching it drift toward the valley below, where a new day began for those who had survived, and an old guilt deepened for those who had not. The young mercenary stirred. "Where to now?" The leader tightened the strap of his saddle. "East. What's there?" Another order. Another fire. He climbed onto his horse. The others followed. The sound of their departure echoed softly between the stones, a rhythm too precise to be human. As they vanished into the mist, the old chapel fell silent again. A drop of rain slid down the stone angel's cheek, glimmering like a tear before it fell. And somewhere far behind them, amid the ashes of the manor, a single raven took flight, its wings black against the rising sun, its cry carrying through the valley like a warning the world refused to hear. The land held its breath. The mercenaries rode on. The sound of hooves grew faint, until only the wind remained, whispering through the empty fields. And in that whisper, if one listened closely, there was something almost human, a question, fragile and unending, of whether men who trade mercy for survival can ever find their way back to grace. The wind moved through the trees like a whisper that had forgotten its origin. It was thin, brittle, and endless, a ghost breath against a world turned to ice. Across the northern frontier, the land had frozen into silence. The rivers lay trapped beneath translucent glass, and beneath that glass, one could still see the faint outlines of bones, fish, men, things that had wandered too far into the dark. The sun was a rumor now, a dim smudge that barely rose before retreating. Days bled into nights, and the nights were long enough to forget there had ever been warmth. Through that pale wilderness rode a company of men who no longer felt the cold. Their armor was rimmed with frost, their faces half hidden beneath iron and shadow. No banners marked their passage. No horns announced their coming. They moved like a single organism, bound by something older than command, by survival, by silence, by the ghosts that rode with them. The sound of their hooves was muffled under the crusted snow, their breath hanging in the air before fading into nothing. They were called many names, though none knew which was true. The Pale Company, some said. The Windborn, the Duke's Shadows. But no name could claim them, for they served no crown that history would remember. They were weapons rented to fear itself, summoned only when the world wished to forget what mercy was. Among them rode a woman. She was small compared to the men, yet every eye, even the cruelest among them, turned away when she passed. Her face was hidden behind a dark veil that clung to her like a shadow that would not let go. No one knew where she came from. No one had ever heard her pray. Some said she could speak with crows. Others swore she never slept, only watched the fire as though reading the ashes for meaning. They called her the Raven Seer. Before every battle, she would walk a little apart from the camp to where the frost clung thickest to the trees. There, in the dead hours before dawn, she would kneel and whisper to the wind. The men pretended not to listen, but they always did. Her voice was low, strange, filled with something that made the air tighten around their hearts. When she finished, the wind would rise suddenly, and the next day, victory always followed. They never asked what bargain she made for it. Some things were better left unnamed. Their latest commission had come from a desperate duke whose lands were bleeding from famine and rebellion. His halls were haunted by the sound of empty kitchens and the whispers of discontent. He spoke of duty, of order, of rebellion that must be crushed before it reached his gates. But behind his words was fear, the kind that smells like sweat and incense. He offered them gold enough to buy redemption, if redemption could ever be bought with such a coin. The contract was signed, the torches lit, and the company rode north to end a rebellion that existed more in rumor than in flesh. They found the first village at dusk. The roofs were half collapsed, the fields crusted over with ice. No smoke rose from the chimneys. A single bell hung from the chapel, its tongue frozen mid-swing. When they entered, the only movement came from a few starving dogs that fled at the sight of them. In the square lay a handful of villagers, too weak to bury their dead. One soldier dismounted, his armor clinking faintly. He crouched beside a boy who clutched a crust of bread hard as stone. "Where are your fathers?" he asked. The boy's voice came like a cracked whisper. "Gone. The Duke took them, so they must fight for his glory." The man looked away. The woman watched. She said nothing, but her eyes moved from face to face, reading something in their silence. By the time they reached the next village, the snow had deepened, and the cold had sharpened its teeth. Here, the people had fled into the forest, their homes abandoned, their fires long dead. The captain ordered his men to search the woods. They went reluctantly, the trees closing behind them like a mouth. Somewhere in the darkness, a branch cracked. Someone shouted, and then the air split with the sound of steel. When the echoes died, the forest was still again. They returned at dusk, their blades darkened, their eyes hollow. Behind them, the snow was no longer white. The woman stepped forward, her boots sinking into red slush. She looked at the captain, who avoided her gaze. "Rebellion?" she asked softly. He said nothing. The wind moved through the trees, carrying the smell of iron and smoke. She knelt beside one of the bodies, a young mother, her arms still wrapped around a child. The woman brushed a lock of hair from her frozen face. The gesture was almost tender. Around her, the men stood in silence. One muttered that the peasants had chosen their fate. Another whispered that the Duke's coin felt heavier than before. The woman raised her hand. A droplet of blood slipped down her wrist and fell into the snow. A single snowflake landed in her palm and melted into red. "The storm," she murmured, "is us." The men said nothing. None of them dared to meet her eyes. That night, they made camp near the edge of the ruins. The fire struggled to live against the wind, throwing long, shivering shadows over their faces. No one spoke for a long time. The youngest of them, a boy with hair too soft for war, finally broke the silence. "Do you think he'll call us heroes?" he asked. The captain turned his blade slowly against a whetstone. "Heroes don't ask," he said. The boy stared at the flame. "Then what are we?" The woman sat a little apart from them, her veil fluttering like smoke. The firelight glowed faintly on her cheek, catching the edge of her gaze. "We are what the wind remembers," she said. The words fell like frost, and even the fire seemed to recoil. No one spoke again. By morning, the snow had covered the bodies. The village looked almost untouched, as if the world itself had tried to hide its sin. The company rode on, their tracks filling behind them as if they'd never been. The cold grew heavier. The horizon vanished beneath veils of fog. The horses moved slower, their breath rising like ghosts. At the crest of a hill, they saw it, the Duke's castle, a black shape against the pale world. Its towers pierced the mist like rusted spears. From its chimneys rose a thin column of smoke, a faint thread of life in an empire of silence. The men stared at it with no triumph in their eyes, only weariness. For every mile behind them was a grave that did not need a name. The woman stopped her horse and turned her face to the wind. She could feel it building, something vast, unseen, inevitable. The Duke's fear, the peasants' hunger, the silence of the gods. All of it rising into a storm that no army could stand against. She closed her eyes. The world around her smelled of blood and ash. "He will summon us again," she said. The captain looked at her, his face pale beneath the steel. "And will you answer?" Her veil shifted in the wind. "I always do." They rode in silence. The snow began to fall thicker, swallowing the world in white. The trees disappeared behind the haze, and even the horses' shadows seemed to vanish. The sound of their passage grew faint, like the echo of something already forgotten. Behind them, in the dead villages, the wind began to move. It whispered through broken doors, over frozen wells, through the hollow bones of the dead. At first, it was only wind. Then, slowly, it became something else, the sound of voices faint and many. Prayers, curses, pleas, the memory of all that had been silenced. The woman heard it, though she did not turn. The others heard it too, though none dared to speak. The wind pressed against their backs as they rode, as if urging them onward, or warning them. When night came, the clouds broke open, revealing a full moon cold and white as bone. Its light spread across the snow, turning the world into a mirror. The company rode beneath it, their shadows long and thin, stretching across the frozen earth. For a moment, it seemed as if time itself had stopped, as if they were trapped between the world they had destroyed and the one they were about to face. The woman raised her head, her veil fluttering against her lips. The wind was loud now, carrying voices that no one could see, each one calling for something they could never give back. "The storm is not coming," she whispered. "It is already here." The men rode on, their faces expressionless, their hearts hollowed by too much silence. The snow fell harder. The world turned to white again, erasing the tracks of the guilty and the innocent alike. And somewhere beyond the horizon, unseen and waiting, another village began to burn. The wind carried the sound to her. She did not flinch. She did not pray. She only listened, as if the world itself were confessing. The snow rose around them, and the land closed its mouth. No one would ever find their footprints. No one would remember their names. Only the wind would remain, whispering through the centuries, telling and retelling the story of the company that came like storm clouds and vanished before the first body fell. And in that wind, sometimes if one listens closely enough, there is still the sound of her voice, faint and far away, murmuring to the endless night, "The storm is us." In the highlands of Alba, where the heather grows wild and purple against the stone, the morning rises without warmth. A sea of fog moves like a living thing, swallowing hill and hollow alike. Beneath it, men advance in silence. Their armor does not gleam, their banners do not rise. They are the unmarked, the forgotten, an army without a name, ghosts born of hunger and vengeance. Their boots sink into the wet earth, muffled by moss. Ravens circle above them, black wings cutting through the milk-white mist. Every sound is swallowed by the land, until the only rhythm left is that of their breath, steady, cold, resigned. They march not for glory, nor for the promise of gold, but because movement keeps despair from festering. Once they were farmers, shepherds, fathers and sons who tilled the soil and prayed for mercy. Then came the famine, a silence that devoured the song of harvests. The king's granaries filled while the fields emptied of life. Mothers buried children in shallow graves, and men turned their prayers into curses. When the grain wagons rolled past their starving villages under royal banners, they broke the axles and slit the horses' throats. The rebellion began not with a cry, but with a hunger that could no longer bear its own body. From that famine, the wolves were born. They gathered in the forest's edge, where the kingdom's light could not reach, and fashioned weapons from rusted iron and grief. Their leader was a soldier once, a captain of the king's own guard, stripped of title for refusing to burn a village that could not pay its tax. His name was whispered but never written. Some called him the Crow Captain, for the black feather he wore behind his ear, taken from the first raven that followed their march. Under his command, they became something neither holy nor damned. They fought for no crown, prayed to no god. They sold their blades when the price was right, and took what they needed when it wasn't. But among themselves, they kept one sacred law: no man starves while another eats. In the cold, that law was their fire. That night, by the ruins of an old monastery, they made camp. The walls had long since collapsed, but the stones still carried the faint scent of incense and death. The fire crackled low, smoke rising through holes in the roof like spirits seeking heaven. Men sat in a circle, sharpening blades dulled by years of war, mending torn leather with thread made of horsehair. No one spoke much. Words had long lost their power to comfort. The youngest among them, a boy not yet grown to manhood, polished his dagger until he could see his reflection in its edge. He looked to the captain, eyes wide with the innocence the others had already buried. "Do you think God forgives men like us?" he asked softly. The captain did not look up. His hands rested over the flames, the scars on his knuckles gleaming like melted wax. For a long moment he said nothing. Then, with a voice roughened by too many winters, he answered only, "God stopped walking these lands when the bread ran out." The boy turned his gaze downward, the dagger trembling in his hand. Somewhere beyond the walls, a wolf howled. It did not sound hungry. It sounded lonely. As the fire sank into embers, the men lay on cold ground, wrapped in cloaks that smelled of mud and blood. The captain did not sleep. His eyes were fixed on the charred cross still standing in the ruins, its arms broken, its base swallowed by ivy. He remembered kneeling once before such a cross, asking for victory, for mercy, for purpose. Now he asked for nothing. When dawn came, it came gray and slow. The mist clung to the ground as if unwilling to let them go. Armor creaked. Horses snorted clouds into the chill air. One by one, they rose and took their places. No orders were given. They all knew the road and what waited beyond it. In the valley below, a small village slept. Thatched roofs and narrow lanes, smoke still curling from the night's fires. Chickens scratched in the mud, unaware of the silence gathering on the hills above. The captain rode at the front, his face unreadable beneath a hood of black wool. He watched the village through the veil of mist, eyes hollow, hands steady. Behind him, one of the men murmured, "They look poor enough, Captain." He said nothing. The reins tightened in his grip. He could see the faint outline of a chapel bell tower, crooked and leaning. The boy from last night rode beside him, pale and quiet. The first toll of the bell came suddenly, one long, mournful sound that carried across the valley like a warning from heaven. Birds burst from the rooftops, scattering into the clouds. Then silence again. The captain's jaw tightened. The bell had not been rung by chance. Somewhere in that village, someone had seen the shapes in the mist and known what was coming. Forward, he whispered. They descended like shadows spilling from the hills. The fog swallowed their shapes until only the glint of steel betrayed them. Doors slammed, a dog barked, then was cut short. Inside the chapel, the priest tried to gather the villagers, clutching a wooden cross as though it could stop the tide. "They are men, not demons," he said, voice shaking. But even he did not believe it. The stories had reached every corner of Alba, tales of a faceless host that left no witnesses, only ashes and whispers. The captain dismounted before the chapel doors. He could hear the villagers breathing inside, shallow, trembling. He rested his palm against the wood. For a long moment, he stood there, listening to the heartbeat of fear on the other side. Then he turned away. "Leave them," he said quietly. The men hesitated. They were hungry. They needed supplies, horses, food, life. But something in the captain's voice froze them. "Leave them," he repeated, sharper now. And so they did. They passed through the village without fire or blood, taking only what they could find abandoned in the streets. A loaf of bread, a broken cartwheel, a sack of oats half buried in the mud. The villagers watched from shuttered windows as the nameless army disappeared once more into the mist, leaving behind only footprints that the rain soon erased. By midday, the sky began to clear. The mountains rose sharp and blue against the horizon. The boy rode behind the captain, the dagger still at his side. "Why do we spare them?" he asked finally. The captain did not answer at first. His gaze remained fixed ahead on the endless stretch of road winding through the moor. "Because mercy," he said slowly, "is the last thing that proves we're still men." The boy nodded, though he did not understand. He would soon enough. As they rode on, the wind shifted. The scent of smoke drifted from the east, not village smoke, but the thick, acrid kind that comes from burning fields. Another army moved somewhere beyond the hills, one that still carried banners and believed in kings. The wolves of Alba would not go unseen for long. That night, they camped beside a river that ran dark and slow. The men washed their hands and faces, the water turning red around their fingers. The boy knelt beside the captain, who sat alone on a stone overlooking the current. "Do you think we'll ever go home?" the boy asked. The captain looked at him, eyes soft for the first time. "We are home," he said quietly. "Everywhere we go, we carry the same ghosts. There is no other place left." The boy looked out over the river. The moon hung low, reflected in the water like a coin at the bottom of a well. He thought of the villagers they spared, of the bell that had tolled once and then never again. He wondered if mercy had a sound, or if it vanished like breath in winter. As the night deepened, the captain drew his cloak tighter. The wind carried the faint echo of drums, distant but drawing nearer. Another kingdom's army, perhaps. Another battle. Another chance for death to forget their names. He closed his eyes and let the sound of the river fill the silence between his thoughts. Somewhere beyond the mist, A single crow called out, its cry stretching over the dark like a question without an answer. The captain rose and looked toward the east, where the first light of dawn trembled against the horizon. "Tomorrow," he murmured, "we march again." The boy followed his gaze. The world before them was vast and empty, yet alive with the faint hum of destiny, as if the land itself was holding its breath, waiting for what these nameless men would become. The mist began to rise again, curling around their feet, swallowing the remnants of the fire, softening the edges of men and steel alike. In its embrace, they vanished once more, a brotherhood bound by hunger, silence, and the faint memory of a prayer that no one remembered how to finish. By nightfall, only the crows would sing,